The morning the whole town of Dust Creek, Texas gathered at the train station to witness what they had collectively decided was an impossibility. The sky was the kind of bruised violet that only comes just before a summer sun breaks itself open across the plains, and not a single soul in that crowd believed that Nelson Graves would ever find a woman who would have him. It was the summer of 1882, and Dust Creek sat fat and ornery along the southern edge of the Texas Panhandle, a town of about 400 souls who had survived drought, cattle plague, and the kind of loneliness that settles into a man's bones like alkali dust. The town had a dry goods store, a telegraph office, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist's office on Thursdays, 2 saloons, a church that leaned slightly to the left, and one enormous shared opinion about Nelson Graves. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that made doorframes seem like an afterthought, with dark hair that curled at the back of his neck and eyes the particular gray-green of sage after rain. He worked the Graves Ranch 3 miles east of town, a spread of good grass and decent water that his father had built before the fever took him 6 winters back. The land was solid, the cattle were healthy, and by any reasonable measure Nelson Graves was a catch. The trouble was his mouth, or rather the trouble was what came out of it, which was not very much at all. Nelson Graves was quiet in a way that people in small towns misread as rude, then misread again as arrogance, and then finally settled on strange. He did not make small talk at the feed store. He did not linger after church to gossip over pie. He had once gone 3 full Sundays without speaking a single word to another human being, which the Reverend's wife found deeply suspicious, and the saloon keeper found downright unnatural. He was kind to his horses and firm with his cattle and devastatingly silent in the company of women, which meant that every young woman who had ever been pointed in his direction had eventually given up and pointed herself somewhere else. There had been attempts over the years. Ruth Ann Pickler had tried courting him back in 1879 and had reported afterward that spending an evening with Nelson Graves was like trying to have a conversation with a fence post, except the fence post had nicer eyes. Clara Donovan had danced with him at the 4th of July celebration in 1880 and declared she would rather take her chances with a circuit preacher. And so the town had arrived at its verdict the way small towns always do, through accumulated gossip and generous exaggeration. And the verdict was that Nelson Graves was a man who would die alone on his good grass with his decent water and his unhelpful silence. Which was why, when old Pete Hawkins had stood up in the Dusty Boot Saloon in April of that same year and laid $2 silver on the bar, and announced that Nelson Graves would never find a woman willing to stay past a second visit, the entire saloon had erupted in the kind of laughter that meant everyone agreed, and within a week, half the town had placed some form of wager on the matter. The odds were not in Nelson's favor. They were not remotely in Nelson's favor. The board behind the bar at the Dusty Boot had his chances listed at something in the neighborhood of 1 in 40, and the 40 was considered generous. Nelson knew about the betting. He was quiet, not deaf. He had heard Pete Hawkins's announcement from his seat in the corner, where he was nursing a glass of whiskey and thinking about whether the north fence line needed replacing before autumn. He had finished his whiskey, set the glass down with care, and ridden home without commenting on any of it, which was precisely the behavior that had gotten the betting started in the first place. What Nelson had not told anyone, because he did not tell anyone anything much, was that he had written a letter to a marriage broker in San Antonio 3 weeks before that evening in the saloon. It was not something he had done rashly. He had thought about it for the better part of a year, turning the idea over in his mind the way he turned a stone in his hand, looking for the weight of it. He was not lonely in the way people assumed he was. He was lonely in a specific, quiet way, the way a room feels lonely when it has good furniture but no fire in the hearth, and he had decided, with the methodical honesty that defined his character, that what he wanted was a woman who was not afraid of silence, who could find something in it rather than feeling buried by it. He had written his letter carefully, which meant he had written it 5 times before he was satisfied with the plain truth of it. He had described the ranch, the land, the house that needed paint on the south side but had good solid bones. He had described himself without flattery and without false modesty. He had said he was a quiet man, and that he understood this was not to everyone's taste, and he had said he was looking for a woman who might find that her own nature was not so different from his. He had sent the letter and he had waited, and he had said nothing about it to anyone in Dusk Creek, and the betting had started without anyone knowing that Nelson Graves had already, in his own methodical way, been trying. The broker had written back in May. There was a woman, the letter said, a Miss Celia Hale of Charleston, South Carolina, 24 years old, recently bereaved of her father, no other family to speak of. She had some teaching experience, good sense according to the broker's rather formal assessment, and she was, the letter noted with what seemed like cautious understatement, a woman who had her own opinions. She had read Nelson's letter and had agreed to correspond, which meant that through the months of May and June, Nelson Graves had been doing something entirely uncharacteristic. He had been writing letters, long ones. Celia Hale's first letter had been careful and measured, the way a person is careful when they are trying to make a fair accounting of themselves, without making promises they are not certain they can keep. She had described Charleston with the particular love of someone who knows they are leaving a place for good and wants to set it down in words before it becomes only memory. She had described her father's death, consumption in the February of that year, swift and unkind, and the way it had left her with a house full of books she loved and no particular future she could see. She had said, in the plainest language, that she was not looking for romance as she understood it from novels. She was looking for a life that made sense and a person she could respect, and she thought perhaps Texas might be where that life was. Nelson had read that letter sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he had felt something shift in his chest, small and careful, like a hinge that had rusted but was not quite broken. He had written back immediately, and then she had written back, and by the time July arrived and the arrangements were made and the ticket was purchased, Nelson Graves had more words in his heart than he had spoken aloud in 3 years, and all of them were for a woman he had never seen. He had told no one. He had gone about his work, ridden the fence lines, doctored a sick calf, replaced the boards on the south side of the house with new paint, hung new curtains in the spare bedroom that the broker had suggested he prepare, and said nothing at all when old Pete Hawkins slapped him on the back at the feed store and told him the odds were now 1 in 50 since Mabel Gunderson had added her own $5 to the pot. Nelson had looked at Pete with his usual unhurried calm and said, "That's so," and loaded his feed sacks and driven home. The train from San Antonio was scheduled to arrive at 9:15 in the morning on the 14th of July, 1882, and Nelson had sent a final letter to Celia letting her know he would be at the platform. What he had not anticipated was that the entirety of Dusk Creek would also be at the platform. He did not know how word had gotten out. He suspected it was the telegraph operator, Marcus Webb, who had never met a secret he could resist sharing, and who had almost certainly read the brief confirmation telegram that Celia had sent the week before confirming her arrival date. However it had happened, by 9 o'clock that morning the station platform was crowded with roughly 150 people who had all found pressing reasons to be in the vicinity of the train station on a Tuesday morning. Nelson stood at the edge of the platform in his good clothes, which were not fancy but were clean and carefully pressed, his hat in his hands, and he felt the weight of all those eyes on his back the way you feel weather coming, that thick low pressure that means something is about to change. He heard the snickering. He heard Pete Hawkins making some remark that produced a burst of laughter from the cluster of men near the water barrel. He heard Mabel Gunderson telling someone that she felt almost sorry for the poor dear girl, Coming all this way for that. He kept his eyes on the horizon where the tracks disappeared into the shimmer of morning heat, and he thought about Celia Hale's letters, the precise and honest way she wrote, the humor that crept in sideways when she was describing something she found absurd, the way she had written about her father not with self-pity, but with a kind of careful tenderness that told him she was a woman who had learned to carry grief without being crushed by it. He thought about the letter she had sent 2 weeks ago in which she had described her impression of Texas from what she had read, enormous and hot, and not particularly interested in anyone's opinion of it. He had read that line 3 times and felt something very close to a smile. He heard the train before he saw it, the low groan of the whistle carrying across the flat land like a question, and then the dark shape of it coming through the heat shimmer, growing solid and real and inevitable. The crowd shifted and pressed forward, and Nelson stayed where he was, still, his hat turning slowly in his hands. The train heaved itself into the station with a great exhale of steam and the screech of brakes, and the platform filled with noise, porters calling out, passengers disembarking, children darting between legs, and Nelson watched the doors. He watched 3 men in business suits step down. He watched a family with 5 children and an enormous amount of luggage tumble onto the platform. He watched an elderly woman in black take the arm of a young man who was presumably her son. He watched a traveling salesman with a sample case and an air of professional optimism. He watched and he waited, and the crowd watched him watching, and someone behind him muttered something that produced another wave of laughter, and he did not turn around. And then she stepped off the train. Later, when he tried to think about that first moment, he would find it difficult to sort out the details from the impression, the way you cannot always separate the lightning from the thunder when they hit at the same time. He registered dark hair, a great deal of it, pinned up under a traveling hat that had seen better days. He registered a blue dress, practical, slightly dusty from the journey, a green brooch at the collar. He registered a carpetbag in one hand and a book in the other, which she had apparently been reading up until the moment of disembarkation and had not yet thought to put away. He registered that she was not looking at him or at the crowd or at anyone in particular. She stepped off the train, set her carpetbag on the platform, tilted her head back and looked up at the sky. It was the sky that she looked at first. The enormous Texas sky, all that heat and blue, stretching in every direction without apology. She looked at it for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds her expression moved through something he could not entirely name. It was not quite wonder and not quite fear and not quite joy, but some combination of all 3, and then she lowered her head and looked directly at him. She had dark eyes. Not brown exactly, more the color of dark honey held up to lamplight, warm and complicated. She looked at him with the same directness she had apparently brought to the Texas sky, a frank, unhurried assessment, and then she walked toward him across the platform, and the crowd parted in the way crowds do when someone moves with enough certainty to require it. She stopped in front of him and said, "You are Nelson Graves." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Celia Hale," she said, and she put out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was warm, and she did not look away. Behind them the crowd had gone very quiet. Quiet in the way that a saloon goes quiet when something unexpected happens, that sudden held breath before everyone starts talking at once. "I read about Texas before I came," Celia said, glancing around at the wide flat street beyond the station, at the dust, at the wooden storefronts with their hand-painted signs. "The book I read described it as a land of extremes." "That's accurate," Nelson said. "Good," she said, and she seemed to mean it. "I grew up in a city that thought of itself as civilized. I find I have had enough of that particular illusion." He picked up her carpetbag. "Is there more luggage?" "2 trunks," she said. "One of them is almost entirely books. I apologize in advance for the wait." "I have a strong wagon," he said. She almost smiled. He could see it at the corner of her mouth, that small contained thing, and he thought it was the most interesting expression he had seen on a human face in some years. They walked down the platform together, and the crowd watched them go. And after a moment Pete Hawkins said, in a voice loud enough to carry, "Well, I'll be damned," which was widely considered the most accurate assessment of the situation. The ride out to the ranch was 3 miles of dust and sun, and the particular smell of Texas summer, which is grass and heat, and something underneath that is almost sweet if you do not think too hard about what is causing it. Nelson drove the wagon and Celia sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for the first half-mile, which would have horrified any of the women who had preceded her in the general direction of Nelson's romantic life, but which Celia Hale appeared to find entirely comfortable. She had set her book on her lap, not reading it, just resting her hands on it, and she watched the land go by with that same frank attention she had given everything else since stepping off the train. "The grass is different here," she said finally. "Different from what?" "From what I imagined, from South Carolina grass. It's thinner, more determined." He considered that. "It has to be out here." "I thought it would feel more empty," she said. "But it doesn't. It feels full of something. I can't put a word to it yet." "Space," he said. "People from the East think space is absence. It isn't." She turned her head and looked at him. "That's the most words you've said at once since I arrived." "I was saying something worth saying." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I read something in your letters that I want to ask you about directly, because I find that direct questions are more efficient than wondering." "Ask," he said. "You said you were a quiet man, and I read that as honesty rather than warning. But I want to know whether the quiet comes from having nothing to say, or from choosing not to say what you think, or from something else entirely." He did not answer immediately, which she seemed to understand was not evasion but actual consideration. "The third thing," he said, "something else. I say what I mean when I think it will land with someone. Most of the time it doesn't, so I don't say it. Do you think it will land with me?" "I'm beginning to think it might," he said. The conversation settled after that, comfortable and intermittent, like rainfall that does not hurry itself. And by the time they turned down the long drive toward the ranch house, Celia had asked him 3 more things, each of them direct and specific, about the cattle operation, about the water situation in dry years, about whether there was a lending library within reasonable distance. He had answered each one honestly, including the admission that the nearest lending library was in Abilene, which was 2 days by wagon, at which point she had looked at her carpetbag and said, "Then it is fortunate I brought books." And the thing at the corner of her mouth had expanded briefly into something that was unambiguously a smile. The ranch house was not large, but it was honest. That was the word that came to Celia's mind as Nelson helped her down from the wagon and she stood looking at it. Low and solid, whitewashed, with a porch along the front and a kitchen garden off to the side that had been recently tended. The new paint on the south side was still bright, not yet weathered to the same comfortable gray as the rest. "You painted it," she said. "Recently," he said. "For my visit." He did not deny it. "The south side needed it." "You painted it for my visit," she said again, not as an accusation but as a recognition of something, and she stood looking at the bright white boards for a moment with an expression he could not read, something soft moving through her features. "Come in," he said. "I'll put water on." She followed him inside, and the house was clean and sparse in the way of a man who lives alone but lives honestly. No decoration for its own sake, every object there because it was useful, but the useful things arranged with care. There were 2 good chairs by the fireplace. There was a shelf of perhaps 20 books, which she went to immediately and surveyed with the quick professional eye of someone who had lived among books her whole life. She ran her finger along the spines and said nothing for a moment. "You have Darwin," she said. "I do. And Thoreau." "Yes." She turned and looked at him in a new way. The men I knew in Charleston who had Darwin on their shelves were usually showing off. They hadn't read it. "I've read it twice," he said. She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she said, which seemed to be a conclusion of some kind, some internal verdict she was rendering, and then she sat down in one of the chairs by the fireplace and looked around the room with an expression that was settling, the way a bird settles, deciding whether the branch will hold. They ate supper together that evening. A simple meal he had prepared, beans and cornbread, and a beef roast that had been in the oven since morning, and they talked more that night than Nelson had talked in 6 months. She told him about Charleston, about her father who had been a teacher of history and who had filled their house with argument and ideas, and had treated his daughter's mind as a thing worth cultivating, which was not the common practice among the fathers of Charleston in 1882. She told him about her mother, who had died when Celia was 11, and about the particular education in self-reliance that had followed. She told him about the consumption that had taken her father, the long cold winter of it, sitting beside his bed reading aloud from history books because it was what he loved, and it was all she had left to give him. Nelson listened. He was a very good listener, the kind that made you feel that every word was being received and considered, not simply waited out while the other person thought about what they would say next. She noticed it. She noticed the specific quality of his attention, its steadiness, the way his eyes did not wander. "You are listening to all of this," she said. "Yes. Most people listen for the parts that remind them of themselves," she said. "You're listening to the parts that are me." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience," she said, "it is almost completely unheard of." They sat on the porch after supper as the sun went down in its extravagant Texas way, all that fire and gold spreading across a sky big enough to hold it, and the heat of the day softened toward something almost bearable, and the first stars appeared one by one like promises being made in the dark. Celia had her book in her hands, but she was not reading it. She was watching the stars arrive. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "Good," he said. "I came here because I had no other clear path, and because your letters suggested you were a person of genuine substance, and I have learned to trust that impression more than most other impressions. I did not come here in love with you, and I think any arrangement built on a pretense of love that does not yet exist would be dishonest and therefore unstable." "I agree," he said. "I came here prepared to build something real if the ground is solid," she said, "and I think the ground might be solid." "I think so too," he said. "That's enough to begin with," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat together in the cooling dark, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, and it was the most comfortable silence Celia Hale had experienced in the 24 years of her life. In the days that followed, the arrangement of the household took shape with the practical efficiency that both of them brought to most things. The guest room, the one with the new curtains, was Celia's, and the proprieties of the situation were observed without discussion, because both of them understood implicitly that what they were building required a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, and that could not be rushed. She was engaged to him in the formal sense. The paperwork existed, the broker had processed the arrangement, but the real engagement was the one they were conducting between themselves, a gradual and careful construction. She began teaching at the Dust Creek schoolhouse in her second week, because the town was in between teachers and because she had the credentials and because it gave her a purpose and an income of her own, which she told Nelson plainly she preferred to have. He had said there was no necessity for it, that the ranch could support them both easily. She had said that was not the point. He had thought about it and said that he understood, which she believed, because he was a man who generally meant what he said. The town's relationship with Celia Hale was a complicated thing. They had expected, given their collective low opinion of Nelson's prospects, some creature of desperation, someone plain or damaged or simply too lacking in options to be discerning. What they got was Celia, who was none of those things. She was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness, dark and direct, and possessed of an intelligence that showed in her face the way Nelson's did in his, understated and real. She was polite to everyone and effusive toward no one, which some of the women of Dust Creek found cold and others found refreshing, and her teaching was, within a week, the subject of considerable positive comment even among parents who had not initially been enthusiastic about a stranger from the East taking charge of their children. The betting situation evolved in interesting ways. By the end of the first week, Pete Hawkins had lost his $2 and the bet itself had mutated into a new form, no longer about whether Nelson would find a woman, but about whether she would stay. The odds on her staying were better than anyone had initially given Nelson's odds, but they were not confident. Mabel Gunderson maintained her position that the Texas summer would drive any Charleston woman back east by September. Marcus Webb, who had the advantage of proximity to the telegraph office, and therefore thought he understood the world better than anyone, gave it until the first hard winter. What they did not account for was the specific character of Celia Hale. She found the betting board in the dusty boot on her second Saturday in Dust Creek, when she had gone in to retrieve Nelson, who had stopped for a glass of whiskey on the way back from the feed store. She stood in the doorway of the saloon, which was slightly irregular for a woman of her station, but she was from Charleston, where irregular was a matter of degree, and she had her own views on where she was permitted to stand, and she read the board with her chin up and her expression very still. Nelson appeared at her elbow. "You don't need to be in here," he said, not unkindly. "I know that," she said. "Look at this board." He looked at it. He had a complicated relationship with the board, which was mostly composed of refusing to acknowledge it. "How long has this been here?" she asked. "Since April," he said. "And you said nothing." There was nothing to say. She turned and looked at him. "Are you bothered by it?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, which was the first time she had heard him admit to being bothered by anything, and the honesty of it landed in her chest with a small, warm weight. "Good," she said. "Then we are both bothered by it. We should do something about it." "What do you suggest?" She looked back at the board. "I suggest we prove them extraordinarily wrong and enjoy it thoroughly." Pete Hawkins, who had been listening from behind his whiskey, coughed. Mabel Gunderson, who was somehow also present, went slightly red. Nelson looked at Celia with something new in his face, something that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. "All right," he said. The proving them wrong was not a campaign so much as a natural consequence of two people who were already doing what they intended to do anyway. The summer moved forward, hot and relentless, and the ranch grew more organized under the combined influence of Nelson's steadiness and Celia's efficiency, and the house began to change in small ways that a visitor would not necessarily be able to point to but would feel. The kitchen garden expanding, the shelf of books doubling, a second set of dishes appearing, the porch acquiring 2 rocking chairs instead of 1. They fell into patterns together, the way two people do when they are fundamentally compatible at the level of daily habit, which is the most underrated compatibility there is. He rose at 5 and she rose at 6, and by the time she came to the kitchen, he had coffee made and was already reviewing the day's work in his head, and she would pour her cup and sit across from him, and they would read separately for half an hour in a silence that was not absence but presence. Then she would ride to the schoolhouse, and he would ride out to the cattle, and they would both work hard all day and meet again in the evening for supper, which became the longest conversation of the day. She taught him things she had learned from her father's history books, told stories about civilizations built and collapsed, about the movements of people across the earth, about the decisions that turned out to matter and the ones that seemed important and did not. He told her things about the land, about cattle and grass and water and weather, about the way a sky looks before a particular kind of storm, and how you can tell by the behavior of your horses. She listened to his knowledge with the same respect she gave to books, which he recognized and valued in a way he could not quite articulate. One evening in late August, they were sitting on the porch in the last light, and she said, "Tell me what you think about. Not what you think about the ranch or the work, what you think about when you are out alone." He was quiet long enough that she might have thought he was not going to answer. "The permanence of things," he said. "The grass has been here longer than any of the people who have ever crossed it. It will be here longer than any of us. I think about what it means to build something on a piece of that ground. Whether it means anything." She set down the book she was holding. "Do you think it does?" "I think it has to," he said, "or it doesn't matter what we do. And I can't live as if it doesn't matter." She looked at him in the failing light, really looked at him, and she felt something shift inside her, not small and careful the way it had been in the earlier weeks, but large and sure the way land shifts when bedrock settles, something fundamental finding its right position. "I think it matters too," she said. "I have always thought so. I just have not known anyone else who was thinking about it." He turned and looked at her. In the gold light of the evening, with the land stretching away behind them and the first star just appearing over the eastern hills, she looked like something that belonged here, something that had always been meant for this particular view. He did not say that, because he was not yet certain how to say things of that nature without sounding like a man in a dime novel, and he distrusted the dime novel version of himself. But he thought it clearly, and she seemed to read something in his expression because she did not look away. "Nelson," she said. "Yes." "I think I am beginning to love you," she said, with the same directness she had brought to every other statement she had ever made to him, no performance in it, just the plain truth laid on the table between them. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe I passed that particular threshold some time ago and was waiting to be certain you might too." She stared at him. Then she laughed, a full and genuine laugh, the kind he had not yet heard from her, and it was the best sound he had heard in many years, the sound of someone surrendering to something joyful without reservation. "You have been holding that in," she said. "Waiting for the right moment," he said. "That is the most romantic thing you have said in 2 months," she said, "which is not saying a great deal, but it was the right moment, so I will credit you fully." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved, that same restrained thing she had noticed in him since the first day, and then he reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch in the warm dark with the vast Texas night spreading above them and the crickets making their ancient noise in the grass, and it was entirely, perfectly sufficient. The courtship, if you could call it that, which both of them might have disputed on the grounds that they had already been sharing a household and a life for 2 months, entered a new phase after that evening. He brought her wildflowers, not extravagant bouquets but single specimens he found in the fence lines or along the creek, things worth noticing, and she pressed them between the pages of her books. She read to him in the evenings sometimes, from history or from poetry, and he listened with that same unhurried attentiveness that she found increasingly precious. He fixed things around the house without being asked, and she improved the efficiency of the ranch's record-keeping system without being asked, and they moved through each other's domains with a natural ease that neither of them commented on because it seemed too essential to risk making self-conscious. The town of Dust Creek watched all of this with the fascination that only the very bored or the very invested can sustain, and the opinion of Celia Hale began to shift in interesting ways. The children she taught adored her, which was impossible to argue with. The parents found that their children were learning more and complaining less. Mrs. Garrett, the Reverend's wife, who had initially been suspicious of a woman from the East with undisclosed views on religion, came around after Celia spent an afternoon helping her preserve the church's water barrel when the seal gave out, without being asked, and without making anything of it. Even Mabel Gunderson, who had the most money and the most pride invested in the position that nothing good would come of Nelson Graves's romantic life, began to revise her assessment somewhere around mid-September, when she encountered Celia and Nelson at the general store and noticed, with the sharp eye of a woman who has observed the whole spectrum of human relating, that when Nelson reached past Celia for something on the shelf and his arm brushed her shoulder, she leaned into it, just slightly. In the automatic way of someone who no longer thinks about where another person ends and their own warmth begins. Mabel went home that evening and looked at the $5 she had placed on the betting board and accepted quietly to herself that she had been wrong, which was not something Mabel Gunderson was accustomed to accepting, and which she found, to her moderate surprise, not entirely unpleasant. There was something about being wrong in the direction of goodness, of a good man finding a good woman, that was almost acceptable. The formal marriage was set for October, which gave the town something concrete to organize itself around, which the town needed badly. It gave the women of Dust Creek a project and the men of Dust Creek a reason to gather and argue pleasantly about who was owed what from the failed betting board. And it gave Nelson and Celia a shared date on the horizon that functioned differently for each of them. She experienced it as a legal formality for something already true in her interior life. He experienced it as a deadline he was anxious to meet. Not because he doubted the outcome, but because he was a man who liked the solidity of things made official. There was one difficulty. It arrived in the form of a man named Lawrence Hale, who turned out to be Celia's cousin, a connection she had not mentioned because she had not thought of him as particularly significant to her life. He appeared in Dust Creek in the second week of September, which was something of a surprise to everyone including Celia, who had not expected him and did not entirely look pleased by his arrival. Lawrence Hale was from the Charleston side of the family, which meant he had opinions about Celia's situation that he delivered with the particular confidence of a man who had not been asked for his opinion, but believed it owed on general principle. He was 35, well-dressed by the standards of Charleston if somewhat overdressed by the standards of Dust Creek, and he carried with him an attitude of rescuing concern that Celia found immediately aggravating. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon while Nelson was out checking the north pasture, which meant that Celia had the initial conversation alone, which was, in retrospect, not the ideal arrangement. "This is a remarkable situation you've put yourself in," Lawrence said, looking around the ranch house with an expression that attempted to be neutral and was not. "I would not call it remarkable," Celia said. She poured him water from the pitcher and set it in front of him without ceremony. "I would call it sensible. Celia, you are a Hale. Your father was an educated man. He would not have wanted. My father was an educated man who valued independent thought," she said, her voice very even. "He would have been delighted that I found a man of substance and good character and a home where my mind has room to operate. Please do not use my father's memory to support arguments he would have disagreed with." Lawrence blinked. "I am trying to help you." "You are trying to manage me," she said, "which is a different thing, and I would appreciate it if you were honest about that so we can have a clear conversation." They were in the middle of this clear conversation, which had not gotten significantly more comfortable, when Nelson arrived back from the north pasture. He took in the scene with his usual calm efficiency, the tension in the room, Celia's set expression, the well-dressed stranger at his kitchen table, and he poured himself water and sat down. "You must be related to Celia," he said. Lawrence looked at him with the assessing expression of a man trying to determine his social footing. "Lawrence Hale," he said, "her cousin." "Nelson Graves," Nelson said. "What is it you want to know about me?" The directness of it appeared to throw Lawrence somewhat. He had expected to have to work up to the interrogation. "I want to know whether you are a man of adequate means and character to take care of my cousin," he said, recovering himself. "He is both," Celia said. "I was asking him," Lawrence said. "And I answered," she said, "because I am the one whose opinion is relevant." Nelson looked at Lawrence steadily. "The ranch runs 140 head. The land is clear-titled and free of debt. I am a man who keeps his word and does not raise his voice. You are welcome to satisfy yourself of any of those things that require satisfaction, and I will help you do so if you want. But I'll tell you now that Celia's judgment on the question is the judgment that matters, and she has already made it." Lawrence Hale looked at his cousin, who was watching Nelson with an expression that made the situation quite clear even to a man not practiced in reading such things. He stayed for 2 days, asked his questions, received his answers, observed his cousin and Nelson Graves move through the simple business of their shared days with a familiarity and a rightness that he could not argue with in any honest way. On his second evening, Nelson took him out to see the north pasture and the cattle, and they had a conversation that Lawrence later described to his wife in Charleston as the most disconcerting conversation he had ever had, because the man was essentially made of bedrock, and there was nothing to argue with, and nothing to improve on, and the only thing to do was go home and admit that Celia had done something remarkably sensible. Lawrence left on a Thursday, shook Nelson's hand at the wagon, kissed Celia's cheek, and told her quietly that their father would have liked him, which was the most genuine thing he had said in 2 days, and which Celia received with a softening of her face that told Nelson, watching from a slight distance, that it had meant something to her. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly. But that evening on the porch she was quieter than usual, and after a while Nelson said, "You miss him." "Always," she said, "more at particular moments." He was quiet. "Lawrence saying that," she said, "about my father, it was the right thing to say." "I didn't expect him to say the right thing. People often manage it when they stop trying to be managing," Nelson said. She looked at him. "You are a very perceptive man." "I have time to think," he said. "I spend a great deal of time alone with cattle, and they do not require much commentary." She laughed again, that full laugh, and he felt it in his chest the same way he always did, the same way he suspected he always would, like something lighting. October came in cooler, and the wedding was held on the second Saturday of the month, at the small left-leaning church, which the Reverend had quietly reinforced on that side over the summer so that by October it stood perfectly straight, which everyone considered a good omen, or at least an improvement. Celia wore the best dress she had, a deep blue-green that she had brought from Charleston and saved for significant occasions, with her dark hair pinned up and her grandmother's earrings, which were the one piece of jewelry she owned that was purely her mother's line. Nelson wore his good suit, which he had pressed at the barber shop, and which fit him the way good clothes fit a man who has the right kind of build for them. The whole town was there, because of course it was. Every person who had ever placed a wager on the bet board was there, and also people who had not placed wagers, and also the children from the schoolhouse who had been brought by their parents on the grounds that it was a historic occasion, and also Pete Hawkins, who had lost his 2 silver dollars and stood in the back row looking somewhat thoughtfully at the floor. The Reverend kept the ceremony to the essentials, which both Nelson and Celia had requested, and when it came to the vows they had written their own, which was slightly irregular, but the Reverend was a broad-minded man for 1882. Celia said, "I came here looking for solid ground and a life that made sense, and I found both of those things and also something I was not specifically looking for, which has turned out to be the most essential thing I have ever found. I promise you honesty, which is the only kind of love I know how to offer, and I promise you presence, which I think may be rarer than honesty. I promise to sit in the silence with you and to speak when it matters and to treat your nature as the valuable thing it is." Nelson stood very still through all of it, listening in his complete way, and when it was his turn he said, "I spent a long time in this country alone, and I was fine with that because I did not know what I was missing. Then I read a letter from a woman who said she was looking for a life that made sense, and I understood for the first time that I had been looking for the same thing and had not known what to call it. You walked off that train and looked at the sky first, and I think I understood then that you were exactly the kind of person who would look at the sky first, and that was the kind of person I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. I promise you steadiness. I promise you honesty. I promise to always give you the silence when you need it and the words when I have ones worth saying." The left-leaning church, now standing straight, was entirely quiet. Then Mabel Gunderson, who was seated in the third row and had not intended to feel moved by any of this, produced a handkerchief and applied it to her eyes, which caused the woman sitting next to her to do the same, which caused a general rustle of handkerchiefs through the female portion of the congregation that rolled like a gentle wave toward the back of the church. Pete Hawkins in the back row thought about his 2 silver dollars, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not mind having lost them at all. The celebration that followed was the most genuinely joyful event Dusk Creek had seen since the courthouse was finished in 1879, which was already considered the high point of the town's social history. There was music from the two fiddle players who were always engaged for celebrations, and there was food that half the women of the town had contributed, and there was whiskey that was considerably better than what the Dusty Boot usually served, because Nelson had ordered a decent bottle from San Antonio for the occasion, and the dancing went on until well past what was respectable. Celia danced. She danced with Nelson, who was not a man who danced with any particular grace but who danced with the same honest commitment he brought to everything else, and she danced with the Reverend and with Pete Hawkins, who turned out to be an excellent dancer and who said to her during one turn, "I owe you and your husband an apology, Miss Celia. We were not very charitable in our expectations." "No," she agreed, "but you seemed sufficiently surprised to make up for it." He laughed. "That's generous of you." "It is my wedding day," she said. "I am permitted to be generous." Nelson danced with her again later, as the evening wound down and the crowd thinned to the most committed celebrants, and this dance was slower, and he held her closer than strictly formal occasion required, and she rested her head against his shoulder for a moment and closed her eyes and felt the specific quality of his steadiness through the whole length of her body, solid and sure and completely his own. "We proved them wrong," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "We did," he said. "I would like to continue doing so," she said, "for as many years as are available to us." His arm tightened around her just slightly. "That is the plan," he said. The years that followed were, in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because the land and the time ensured that difficulty was always available. There was a drought in the summer of 1883 that took the grass down to stubble and required selling 30 head at a loss that was painful but manageable because Nelson had always been careful with the ranch's finances. There was a fever that went through the schoolhouse in the spring of 1884 and kept Celia at home nursing children who were not her own, because there was no one else, and she was not the kind of woman who could watch children suffer without doing everything in her power. There were arguments, of course there were, because two people with strong convictions and the intelligence to back them will not always agree, but their arguments had the quality of their conversations, direct and honest, and they resolved with the same directness, not grudgingly but genuinely, because both of them were committed to the thing they were building and understood that resentment was structural damage. In the autumn of 1883, a year after the wedding, Celia told Nelson on the porch one evening, with her usual directness, that she was pregnant, and the expression that moved across his face was something she had not seen before and did not have precise language for, something vast and slightly undone. A man who was not accustomed to being overwhelmed by feeling being overwhelmed by it, and she stood up from her rocking chair and put her arms around him and held on. And he held her back with a fierceness that said everything the words were not yet finding. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, in April, when the grass was coming back and the ranch was green, and the terrible drought of the previous summer was a thing that had been survived and was now behind them. He was a solid, dark-haired boy who came into the world with a kind of purposeful determination that both his parents recognized, and Nelson held him in the kitchen of the ranch house in the early morning after the doctor had gone, and Celia was sleeping the deep sleep of the accomplished, and he stood at the window looking out at the land that was his father's land and was now his son's land, and he thought about what he had told Celia on the porch that first summer, about permanence and whether things meant anything, and he understood now, in the most visceral way, that they did. They named him Henry after Celia's father. Henry Graves grew into a boy who was exactly the combination you would predict from those two people. Quiet like his father, curious like his mother, with eyes the honey dark of Celia's and the particular stillness of Nelson's that made people think he was older than he was. He was at home on horseback almost before he was entirely comfortable on foot, and Celia filled the house with more books and read to him every evening, and Nelson took him out into the pastures and taught him the language of grass and cattle, and weather that he himself had learned from his own father. Dust Creek grew through those years, the way towns on the Texas frontier grew, fitfully and with considerable drama. The railroad brought more people. A second church was established, which caused some controversy. The Dusty Boot got a rival establishment. The school expanded to require a second teacher, which meant Celia had a colleague, a young woman from Missouri named Dorothea Parks, who was nervous and very capable, and whom Celia took under her considerable wing with a practical generosity that Dorothea talked about for the rest of her life. The betting board was removed from the Dusty Boot at some point in 1884, its glory having rather comprehensively run its course. No formal announcement was made about its removal. One morning it was simply gone, and Pete Hawkins, who was still a regular at the bar, said when asked that he had taken it down himself and considered it long overdue. The general consensus was that this was the right decision, and that perhaps the whole business had not been very sporting to begin with. Mabel Gunderson, who had never publicly admitted to losing her $5, underwent a more private revolution. She had come, over 2 years of proximity to Celia Hale Graves, to respect her in the specific and somewhat grudging way of a woman who recognizes quality in another woman and cannot pretend she does not. She appeared one afternoon in the fall of 1884 at the school to ask whether there was anything needed from the town council, of which she was the de facto, if unofficial, head, and she and Celia had a conversation about the school's book collection that turned into a genuine collaboration. And by the following spring, the school had 3 new shelves of books purchased through a fund that Mabel had organized with the particular bulldozing efficiency that had made her the de facto head of the town council in the first place. Celia did not say "I told you so," because she was not that kind of woman, and also because it would not have been accurate. She had not told anyone anything. She had simply gone about living in the way that seemed true to her, and the town had come to its own conclusions by proximity. In 1885 there was a second pregnancy, and this time the labor was harder, a long night and a long morning, and the doctor who came was the same steady man who had been there for Henry, and Nelson spent those hours in the most sustained agony of his adult life, which he endured with the usual outward stillness that no longer fooled Celia for a moment. She knew perfectly well what his stillness cost him. She came through it. The child came through it. A girl this time, born in the long gold afternoon of an October day, small and fierce, and equipped from the first moment with an expression of critical assessment that made the doctor laugh. They named her Eliza, which was Nelson's mother's name, and which Celia had suggested and Nelson had received with a quiet that meant something deep had been touched. Henry was 18 months old, and regarded his sister with the wary respect of someone who has been warned that something is coming, and has come to understand that the warning did not do the thing justice. Eliza, from her first weeks, had opinions about everything and the vocal capacity to express them, which made her, in temperament, very nearly the opposite of her father and her brother, and the house was considerably louder for her presence, which both Nelson and Celia found, to their own surprise, quite wonderful. The ranch grew through the mid-1880s. Nelson acquired additional acreage to the north when the adjoining homesteader, a man named Curran who had broken his health trying to farm land too dry for farming, decided to sell and go back to Ohio. Nelson paid him a fair price, which was more than the land was strictly worth in the current market, but less than a man needed to start over in Ohio, and he paid it without calculation or fanfare, because that was the kind of thing his own father had said a man did, and it seemed right to him. The additional land meant more cattle and more work, and Nelson took on 2 ranch hands, brothers named Alejandro and Emilio Ruiz from San Antonio, who had been working a ranch to the south that had sold out. They were good workers and honest men, and they built a small bunkhouse on the north side of the property and became a fixed part of the ranch's daily life. Celia treated them with the same straightforward respect she gave everyone she thought worth respecting, which they recognized immediately, and Alejandro's wife, a quiet woman named Fernanda who came with them in the spring of 1886, became someone Celia genuinely valued. They had an unexpected and pleasing friendship, conducted partially in Celia's limited but effortfully improving Spanish and Fernanda's considerably better English. About books and children and the specific difficulty of living in a country that did not always acknowledge you as belonging to it. This was something Celia thought about. She was aware, and Nelson with her, that the Texas frontier in the 1880s was a place of injustice layered on injustice, that the land they farmed had been somebody else's before it was theirs, that the treaties that had moved the Comanche and Kiowa onto reservations were broken things built on bad faith, that the men who had built this territory had done so with costs paid by others. She thought about it honestly and talked about it with Nelson honestly, and he agreed with her in his quiet way, which meant he had thought about it too and found no comfortable answer and was not interested in performing comfort he did not feel. What they could do, within the small territory of their own lives, they tried to do, fairly and without theatrics, because justice done for the benefit of being seen doing it was not really justice. She raised Henry and Eliza with this understanding, as explicitly and as carefully as she raised them with books and honest speech. She taught in the schoolhouse where the children of Dust Creek came in all the variety that the Texas frontier produced, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and drifters, Mexican children whose families had been in Texas before the Anglo settlers arrived, and she treated all of them with the same precise educational respect that her father had given her, which was the most radical thing she did, and the thing for which, in later years, she was most warmly remembered. By the end of 1886, the ranch was prosperous, not extravagantly wealthy but solidly well, the kind of well that is built slowly and held securely. The house had been expanded, a new room added on the east side so that Henry and Eliza each had their own space, and the kitchen had been improved, and the porch had been reinforced and now held 4 rocking chairs, 2 large and 2 small, because Henry at 2 years old had decided he needed his own chair and Nelson had built him one, and then built a smaller one still for Eliza when she arrived at the chair-demanding age. On a Saturday evening in the November of 1886, Nelson and Celia sat on the porch in the 4 chairs, 2 of which were occupied by sleeping children, Henry's dark head tipped against the armrest, Eliza's small fist curled around the chair's edge even in sleep, and the night was cool and full of stars, that enormous Texas sky doing its usual lavish work. Nelson said, "Are you happy here?" She turned to look at him. It was a question he had never asked her before, not in those terms, because they were both people who lived their satisfaction rather than stating it, and the question in his voice had a quality she recognized, a man checking to be sure, needing to hear the thing said rather than assumed. "Yes," she said, and then, because she was Celia and plain truth was her native language, more completely and more honestly than I have been happy anywhere or with anyone. I was not looking for this kind of happiness. I did not know it existed in this exact form. I came here looking for solid ground, and I found that, and I found you, and the two are so related at this point that I cannot tell them apart. He looked at her in the starlight, this woman who had walked off a train with a carpetbag and a book, and looked at the sky first, and told him the truth from the very first moment. And he felt the full weight of everything they had built together. The house and the land and the children sleeping in the chairs and the years and the conversations and the silences and the arguments and the resolutions and the ordinary extraordinary dailiness of a life shared with someone who saw you clearly and chose to stay. "Good," he said. "Is that all?" she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I love you," he said, with the same plain directness that had come to characterize the best things he said to her. No performance in it, just the fact, offered cleanly. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the same way he had taken hers on the porch that summer evening 4 years ago when they had only just admitted to beginning. "I know," she said, "and I love you. As much as I am capable of loving anything, which turns out to be considerably more than I had estimated when I was 24 and sitting in Charleston with my father's books and no clear future." He squeezed her hand. Henry shifted in his small chair and made a sound in his sleep that was very nearly a snore, which broke the solemnity of the moment in exactly the way small children always break things, perfectly and without apology. Celia laughed. Nelson smiled, the full version now, the one she had worked patiently and genuinely to earn, and that still felt every time like a particular kind of gift. The years continued to pass, the way years do when they are full and good, with the particular speed of time that is rich with living. In the spring of 1888, Celia was 30, Nelson was 34, Henry was 4, and Eliza was 2, and the schoolhouse was well established and had a second proper teacher alongside Celia in the form of Dorothea Parks, who had become confident and capable, and was no longer nervous. The ranch hands Alejandro and Emilio had become such a fixed part of the operation that Nelson could not quite remember what the ranch had been like before them, and Fernanda and Celia's friendship had produced a joint effort to establish a small lending library in the back room of the dry goods store, which became something the town was prouder of than almost anything else in its brief history. The library had been Celia's idea, and Fernanda's organizational genius, and Mabel Gunderson's funding, which was a collaboration that could only have happened in a world where several strong-willed women had found each other in a small town and decided that the town needed what they thought it needed. The Reverend's wife donated her own collection of 30 volumes. Marcus Webb, the telegraph operator, donated a set of encyclopedias that he had owned for 15 years and never opened. Pete Hawkins donated $5, which was coincidentally the same amount he had originally won from the betting board before losing his original $2 to Celia's arrival, and which he produced with a kind of ceremonious satisfaction that suggested he felt the circle was now properly closed. The library opened on a Tuesday morning in April 1888, and the whole town showed up, which was something that happened in Dust Creek whenever something genuinely good occurred. The collective instinct to witness the good thing, to stand together in its presence and acknowledge it. Celia stood at the door and welcomed people in with the particular warmth she reserved for things she had worked for and believed in. Nelson stood slightly back in the way he always did, watching, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his contentment expression, that settled, complete quality of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. Henry stood beside his father, small and solemn, his dark hair combed for the occasion. Eliza was on Nelson's hip, having very recently discovered that the hip was her preferred mode of conveyance. She looked at everything and everyone with the critical assessment that was her native expression, and periodically said things that were almost words with the confidence of someone who is certain they are communicating. Fernanda came to stand beside Celia at the door, and they looked together at the room full of their townspeople moving through the shelves with the particular reverence that most people have for books even if they do not read them often, that understanding that books are the accumulated thinking of humanity and that they are worth treating carefully. "We did this," Fernanda said, quietly in English. "We did," Celia said. "Your father would have approved." Celia looked at her friend with a slight warmth of surprise that anyone who had not known her father could speak of him with that certainty, and then remembered that she had told Fernanda a great deal about him in the conversations of 4 years of friendship, and that Fernanda had listened in the complete way that good listeners do, receiving the person described as a real person rather than a story. "Yes," Celia said. "He would have been particularly pleased about the Darwin." They had 2 copies of Darwin on the shelves, because Celia had contributed her own, and Fernanda had found a second copy at a market in San Antonio. Nelson had pointed out that this meant Dust Creek, Texas, population roughly 500 by 1888, had a better ratio of Darwin per capita than many larger cities, which was the kind of observation that only Nelson Graves would make, and that Celia had written down in the back of her journal, because she was inclined to write down the things he said that were worth keeping. The spring passed into summer, and the summer into another autumn and another year, and the rhythm of the life at the Graves Ranch continued its well-established pattern with the comfortable variations that come from children growing and land working, and people knowing each other more completely year by year. Nelson expanded the cattle operation in the spring of 1889, responding to a demand from a buyer in Fort Worth who had sought him out based on recommendation. And this meant more work and more hands, and a season of particular intensity that he drove himself through with his usual methodical energy, while Celia ran the house and the school with the efficiency she had always brought to whatever was in front of her. At the end of that season, when the sale was completed and the numbers were settled and the result was better than had been hoped, Nelson came home on a Friday evening and sat at the kitchen table and told her the outcome, and she looked at the figures he had written out and said, "We should expand the house." And he said, "I was thinking the same thing." And they planned it together at the kitchen table over 2 hours and a pot of coffee that went cold twice, designing it the way they designed most things together. With both of their kinds of intelligence at work, his practical and spatial and experienced, hers organized and thoughtful and unafraid to suggest what was ambitious. The new addition to the house was built the following summer, a proper second story that gave the children genuine bedrooms and gave Nelson and Celia a bedroom that looked east over the ranch, toward the place where the sun came up, which Celia had specified and Nelson had built exactly to specification because it seemed important and because he understood by now the ways that light mattered to her. On the morning the addition was finished, she stood in the new bedroom in the early morning and watched the sunrise from the east window, the full extravagant Texas production of it, the sky going through its whole sequence of color from black to dark blue to that particular bruised violet she had noticed the very first morning she arrived, and then the gold breaking across everything, the grass and the cattle and the dust of the yard, and the faces of her children who had come to stand beside her one by one. Drawn by some instinct of the important, Henry first and then Eliza, both of them looking at the sunrise with the specific wide-open attention of children who have not yet learned to take beautiful things for granted. Nelson came last, standing in the doorway of the new room, coffee in hand, and looked at the three of them silhouetted against the east window, his wife and his children against the Texas sunrise, and he felt the same thing he always felt at the moments that were most completely his life, that full and settled knowing. Celia turned her head and found him there and held out her hand, and he came and took it and stood beside her and watched the sun come up over everything they had built together, the land and the house and the years of honest living, the children who were theirs and the community they were part of, and the library in the back of the dry goods store, and the school and the friendships and the conversations, and the thousands of hours of porch sitting, with the stars coming out one by one over the vast Texas night. Pete Hawkins had long since paid all his debts and apologized to anyone who would let him. The betting board was gone, replaced, somewhat ironically, by a list of the library's newest acquisitions. Mabel Gunderson had become something close to a friend, the complicated kind, the kind you earn through honesty and shared projects and mutual respect built slowly like a wall from good stone. The Reverend's church stood perfectly straight. Dorothea Parks was the best teacher in 3 counties and had recently received an offer from the county school's office, which she had declined on the grounds that Dust Creek suited her. In the early summer of 1890, 8 years after Celia had stepped off the train with her carpetbag and her book, and looked at the sky before anything else, Nelson and Celia sat on the porch in the evening and the children were inside. Henry doing the reading his mother had assigned, and Eliza doing the drawing she had taken to, with a single-minded intensity that suggested she had found her vocation at age 5. The air was cooling and the first star was out, that same first star that had been there every evening since their first summer, that reliable brilliance in the same patch of darkening east. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" Nelson said. "Of course," she said. The whole town was on the platform. "I noticed that," she said, dry. "Did you know about the betting?" "Marcus Webb told me about it by the second day," she said. "He could not help himself." Nelson looked at her. "You knew from the second day and you never said anything." "I said something to you about it the following Saturday in the saloon," she said. "You said we should prove them wrong," he said. "I thought you meant you had just found out." "I had known for almost a week," she said. "I wanted to have my own view of the situation before I decided how to feel about it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the evening light. "You are the most self-contained person I have ever met," he said, and it was entirely a compliment. "You are not far behind," she said. He smiled. She had worn that smile into the world over 8 years, the full version, the one that changed his whole face, and she was still not tired of it. She thought she would not be tired of it in 40 years. She thought she would probably be right. "I am glad you came," he said. The words were simple and they were his, and they were, in the economy of Nelson Graves, the equivalent of a very long speech. "I know," she said. "I am glad I came too. I am glad every morning when I wake up in a place that makes sense. I am glad every evening on this porch. I am glad every time Henry gives something an honest answer instead of an easy one and I see where he learned it. I am glad you painted the south side of the house before I arrived. I was glad the moment I saw it." He looked at the south side of the house. The paint he had put on in 1882 had been repainted since twice, and the house had grown around it, but the south wall was there as it had always been, solid and honest. "I wanted you to know someone had prepared for you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I noticed it." They sat in the cooling evening, and the star was joined by another and then another, the whole slow abundance of them. And from inside the house came the sounds of their children, Henry's occasional murmur and Eliza's more frequent commentary, the sounds of the house being fully inhabited, the sounds of a life that was real and entire and good in every way that could be measured, and some ways that could not. Celia leaned her head back against the rocking chair and looked up at the stars with the same frank attention she had given the Texas sky on her first morning, still the same impulse, still that particular quality of seeing. She was 32 years old and she was healthy and the ranch was thriving, and she had 2 children who were interesting, and she had a husband who was the most genuinely good man she had ever encountered, and she had books and a library and a school, and a friendship with Fernanda that had survived 4 years of honest conversation. And she had the porch and the stars and the Texas night that was never fully dark because there were always those stars. She thought about her father, as she often did in the evenings when the quality of the light was that particular gold. She thought he would have come out here and sat on this porch and looked at the sky and then had a long conversation with Nelson about the permanence of things and been greatly satisfied by what he found. She thought he would have loved Henry's gravity and been somewhat alarmed by Eliza's volume and been entirely pleased with both outcomes. "What are you thinking?" Nelson asked. "My father," she said, "that he would have liked all of this very much." "I think so too," he said. "From everything you have told me about him." She turned her head to look at him. "You would have made him work for his opinion of you," she said. "You would not have tried to impress him, and he would have respected that, and he would have come around." "Like Lawrence," Nelson said. "Faster than Lawrence," she said. "My father had better instincts." Nelson looked back at the sky. "I would have liked to know him." She felt the warmth of that, the specificity of it, this quiet man choosing to say the generous thing because it was true. She reached across to him, and he took her hand, and they sat like that in the dark with the stars multiplying above them and the sound of their children inside and the land all around them. Their land, their life, whole and closed and real and good. The town of Dust Creek would talk about Nelson Graves for years after that summer of 1882, the way small towns talk about the things that became legend in their own history. They would talk about the betting board and the woman who walked off the train, and the story would improve with the telling the way all good stories do, gaining color and detail. Pete Hawkins's $2 becoming 5. The odds against Nelson becoming increasingly astronomical. The crowd on the platform becoming every single person in the territory. But the essential truth of it would never change and never needed to, because the essential truth was the best version of the story anyway. The whole town had bet against the quiet cowboy, and then she walked off that train with a carpetbag and a book and looked at the sky first, and he had been waiting there with his hat in his hands, and the rest of it had unfolded with the patient, inevitable rightness of two people who were, in all the ways that actually mattered, exactly suited to finding each other. Henry Graves grew to be a man who was everything you could predict from his parents, and he did not leave Dust Creek but stayed on the land that was his grandfather's and his father's, and that would one day be his. And he was a fair man and a quiet one, and he found a woman, eventually, who understood the silence and found something in it rather than being buried by it. Because that was the kind of man he was, and that was the kind of woman such a man finds. Eliza Graves grew to be a woman who was impossible to predict from anyone, and who became an artist of some small regional reputation, whose drawings of the Texas landscape were collected by people who could afford to collect things, and who valued the precise and loving attention with which she had recorded the particular quality of light on grass that nobody else seemed to see the same way she did, which was the quality of light her mother had been seeing on that landscape since 1882, and which she had, apparently, passed on. The library in the back of the dry goods store outgrew its room and became its own building by 1895, a proper small library with 2 rooms and more shelves than could be filled, so the town kept filling them, and it bore a small plaque above the door that was placed there by the town council at Mabel Gunderson's insistence. The plaque said simply, "Established 1888." It did not say whose idea it had been, because the women who had made it happen were not particularly interested in the credit, only in the library, and also because the plaque would have needed to be quite large to hold all the names. Nelson Graves lived to be an old man, which was not guaranteed in Texas in the latter decades of the 19th century, but which he achieved through the combination of good sense and general good health, and the specific grounding effect of a life with genuine purpose. He remained quiet in the way he had always been quiet, the quality of it unchanged by the years, but those who knew him, and many did by then, understood it for what it was, which was attentiveness rather than absence. Celia Graves taught school in Dust Creek until 1902, when the demands of the expanded ranch and the grandchildren that began to appear required a redistribution of her time, and she handed the school over to a young woman from Dallas who had the right combination of intelligence and stubbornness, and whom Celia mentored with the same practical generosity she had given Dorothea Parks 20 years earlier. She did not stop thinking or reading or forming opinions, because that was not a thing Celia Hale had ever been capable of stopping, and she continued to be the most interesting and the most honest and the most direct person in whatever room she occupied for the rest of her considerable life. They had years together, many of them, and they were good years in the full meaning of the word, not without pain or difficulty or loss, because those things are the texture of real life, and no amount of goodness eliminates them entirely, but good in the foundational sense, built on solid ground by people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing in the daily ongoing way that real love requires. On many evenings for many years, they sat on the porch in the 4 rocking chairs, or the 2 rocking chairs when the children were grown and gone, and it was only the 2 of them again, and the land and the stars. He would look at the horizon and she would look at the sky, those 2 specific gazes that had defined them since the beginning, And sometimes they talked and sometimes they were quiet, and the quiet was never absence between them. It was presence, the fullest kind, two people who had found in each other the thing they had not known to look for, which was a silence that was entirely inhabited, entirely warm, entirely home. The last thing she said to him on any ordinary evening, in the way that last things happen without knowing they are last, was what she said every evening, because she had said it since the beginning and it had never stopped being true. "I am glad I came." And he said what he always said. "Good. So am I," and the stars came out over Texas one by one, the same stars that had always been there, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small lit lives below them, and entirely, inexplicably, exactly right as a backdrop for the whole thing.